I'll be talking about a subject called honor-related violence and oppression. This is a situation where young men and women are abused or threatened due to issues around honor and shame. I'm going to talk about how I developed this interest and how to challenge the issue. The first thing in terms of developing the interest, when I was 17 years old, I was in my parents' vehicle. You can see here this Isuzu Trooper, and I was driving to the corner store. And a South Asian store owner saw me, and he looked at me puzzled, and as I walked into the store, he said, "You're one of the good ones." By that, what he meant was, in his eyes, I wasn't living up to the image of the Jamaican criminal that people were seeing in Toronto in the media and newspapers and so forth, importing crime and violence to Canada from Jamaica in terms of robberies and murders and drugs and those types of things. Somehow, me being in this vehicle, I was different. I guess he could have thought I stole it, but he didn't. So in terms of challenging racism, these experiences led me to want to study more about how to challenge it and understand it. And so I went to a number of different universities studying sociology and criminology and social work to get a better understanding of these issues. I also worked as a youth worker and eventually became a police officer. As a police officer working in the domestic violence unit, I noticed when we had cases of violence against women, particularly, and they involved South Asian and Muslim communities, there was a talk in the office of how culture was involved and how potentially, kind of like the Jamaican criminal, culture was being imported from South Asia and other countries to Canada in terms of violence. And basically the only way to fix the issue was to fix the culture. And I thought that this, again, was similar to the Jamaican criminal. It was something I needed to study more about. It was problematic. It needed to be challenged. And so at UBC, I undertook doctoral studies to get a better sense of this issue by talking to service providers in Alberta, Ontario, and BC about this issue in terms of how they understand it and how they challenge the issue. And so that's my ultimate goal, is to then bring this learning back to professionals at a theoretical and a practice level so we can work better with victims and communities. Now I'm going to come back to this graph with some examples. But people tend to jump to honor killings in the media, sensationalized. We can miss out on other things happening. We can miss out on emotional violence, economic violence, confinement and threats, and other things like that. And as I said, I'm going to come back to this slide with examples. So if we look at two cases, these are fictitious, but they're related to real cases. The names have been changed. So we have Yasmin and Melanie. They're two Canadian young women, 17 years old. One is of Islamic background, Middle Eastern background, but she's Canadian, and the other is a Christian fundamentalist background in terms of their families. They have strong views this way. So Yasmin's family basically tell her that she cannot be married before, or she cannot have sex before marriage, and that they have an arranged marriage for her with somebody, and if she doesn't abide by their rules, she can be forced into marriage or killed. Her mother finds out she's in fact dating somebody and strangles her and threatens to force her into marriage. We have Melanie's, whose family is of a strong Christian fundamentalist background. They also threaten her if she was to have sex outside of marriage, and they find out she's in fact pregnant with a child. So they force her to marry the father of the child and threaten they will disown her if she doesn't. So if we look back at this graph from earlier, we can see with Melanie and Yasmin, there's the emotional violence. They're both being told that they will shame the families if they go against their wishes in terms of dating before marriage. And economic violence, which I didn't get into, but both were not allowed to work outside the home. The threats, basically Melanie was threatened that her unborn baby would be killed by her parents. And for Yasmin, she was threatened that she would be killed. Physical violence, Yasmin's mother strangled her, and they were both said that they would be excommunicated from their families and essentially forced into marriages. Through my research, I've learned the best practices for dealing with these issues is an culturally integrative approach, where ethnocultural organizations, mainstream organizations, school counselors, settlement workers, and the police, and child welfare workers and others come together to work on the issue. So if we look at the case of Yasmin with a culturally integrative approach, we find out the family has experienced some migration issues around political violence in their country of origin, some economic issues, the father is unemployed, and in terms of the religion, they have a really rigid view of their interpretation of it, so male-female gender roles are unequal. So the team, a culturally integrative team, uses the resources of the family. There's certain family members who don't feel the same way. There's an uncle who doesn't support the views of the family, so he's used to challenge the views of the family. There's also an imam in the community who teaches about equal relations between men and women, and they are used to engage the family. In terms of outcome, Yasmin's mother is arrested for the assault. The rest of the family receive counseling, her mother in additional well. The imam and uncle attempt to change their views, and over time they're able to shift their views with extensive counseling and support from their family, and at some point Yasmin is able to be reunited with her family. For Melanie, she suffers years of financial, sexual abuse in her marriage, and at some point she gains the courage to leave that marriage. And again, a cultural integrative team is put together to work with her. It consists of police, victim service workers, and a pastor in the community who has views that are a bit more open than the church and the family, to support them and challenge them to try and shift the views of the family. The family is engaged, but the family decide that they do not want to shift their views at all. And so in the end, Melanie leaves the family. She is supported. She becomes a counselor based on her experiences and able to help victims. And her daughter, who she has, is also doing well as well. She has minimal contact with her family after. What can we do? We can use a culturally integrative approach where we use the best resources from the community to work together. And we can also look at cultures as heterogeneous. So we have the two examples. We have Islamic culture, Muslim culture, Christian culture, but all the people in that culture do not behave the same way, and there's differences, there's distinctions, and so forth. And I hope that I showed that with those two examples. Thank you.